It is late afternoon at the edge of the Sahara, and the light has turned the color of old honey. The sun hangs low over an ocean of sand that stretches beyond sight, beyond comprehension. You stand at the boundary between two worlds, where the last scrub vegetation gives way to dunes that roll like frozen waves toward a horizon that shimmers and dissolves in the heat. Behind you, faintly, the sounds of a town, voices calling in Arabic and Tamazight, the braying of donkeys, the clatter of commerce. Before you, silence. A silence so profound it has weight, texture, presence. And then emerging from that silence like a vision, you see them. A line of camels, perhaps 50, perhaps 100, moving in single file across the face of a distant dune. Even from this distance you can see the way they move, that distinctive swaying gait, patient and inexorable. They are loaded with something, great rectangular blocks strapped to their sides, and as the wind shifts you catch a scent, faint but unmistakable, mineral and clean, salt. This is a caravan returning from the deep desert, from places where water is a memory and the sun is a constant enemy, bringing back the white gold that for thousands of years was worth more than the yellow gold buried in the earth. This is the old trade, the trade that built empires and connected civilizations, the trade that transformed the Sahara from barrier into bridge. Tonight we are going to walk those ancient routes together. We are going to feel the heat of the salt mines, taste the dust of the caravan trails, and stand in the markets where salt was weighed against gold. We are going to meet the people who crossed this impossible desert, not once, but again and again, year after year, generation after generation, carrying on their backs the substance that preserved food, sustained life, and generated unimaginable wealth. This is not a story of kings alone, though kings appear in it. This is not a story of battles, though conflict runs through it like a thread. This is a story of trade, of human ingenuity, of the ways that necessity and desire can carve roads across landscapes that seem to forbid all passage. It is a story written in sand and salt, in gold dust and ancient manuscripts, in the memories of peoples whose ancestors walked these routes when Rome was young and whose descendants walk them still. So now let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let go of the present moment, with its haste and its electric light. Step back with me into a time when the world was larger, when distances were measured in weeks and months rather than hours, when a journey across the desert was an act of faith as much as commerce. Settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and prepare to travel. We have a long way to go, across time and sand, following the salt roads of the ancient Sahara. The Sahara you see today, this vast emptiness of sand and stone and merciless sun, has not always been a desert. If you could travel back in time, back past the caravans and the empires, past the first humans to cross these spaces, back 10,000 years or more, you would find yourself in a different world entirely. The Sahara was green, not everywhere, not all at once, but green in the way that sustains life, that invites settlement, that offers possibility. There were grasslands here, savannas where antelope grazed and predators hunted. There were lakes, some of them vast, fed by rivers that flowed from highlands that caught the rain. The climate was different then, the monsoons reached further north, and water was not the desperate scarcity it would become. We know this not from written records, for writing had not yet been invented, but from other forms of evidence that speak across the millennia. In caves and on rock faces across the Sahara, from the Tassilian Ager Plateau in Algeria to the mountains of Chad, there are paintings and engravings left by the people who lived in that greener world. These images are astonishing in their detail and their beauty. You can see giraffes, their long necks stretched toward acacia trees. You can see elephants and hippopotami, rhinoceros and crocodiles. You can see cattle being herded, their horns elaborately curved, attended by human figures rendered in ochre and white. You can see scenes of hunting, of dancing, of daily life. These are not the images of a people struggling to survive in harsh conditions. These are the images of a people at home in their world, confident enough in their survival to make art. But climate is never static, and over thousands of years the patterns shifted. The monsoons that had brought rain began to weaken, to retreat southward. The lakes began to shrink, their shores marked now by ancient beaches high above the dried lake beds. The rivers slowed, became seasonal, then vanished altogether. The grasslands withered, the animals moved south and east, following the water and the vegetation, and the people had to make a choice. Some followed the animals, moving into the regions that would become the Sahel and the savannas of West and Central Africa. Others stayed, adapting to the new reality, learning to live in an increasingly arid landscape. They concentrated around the remaining water sources, the oases where underground aquifers still reached the surface, where date palms could still grow, where life, though harder, was still possible. The transformation was slow, measured not in lifetimes but in centuries. Each generation knew a world slightly drier than the one their grandparents had known. The desert did not arrive as a catastrophe but as a creeping presence, inexorable and patient. The rock art changes during this period. The images of abundant wildlife give way to more stylized forms, to geometric patterns, to representations that seem more symbolic than naturalistic. The human figures appear more frequently with weapons, with tools adapted to a harsher existence. And eventually they appear with something new, something that would change everything. Camels. The camel was not native to Africa. It was domesticated in the Arabian Peninsula, and it arrived in North Africa sometime around the first few centuries before the Common Era, brought by traders and migrants who understood its extraordinary value. The camel is a miracle of evolution, perfectly adapted to desert existence. It can go for days without water, drawing on fat reserves stored in its hump. It can tolerate temperature extremes that would kill other animals. It can eat thorny plants that would shred the mouth of a horse. Its broad padded feet allow it to walk on sand without sinking. And crucially for our story, it can carry heavy loads up to 300 pounds across distances that no other beast of burden could manage. The arrival of the camel in the Sahara was like the arrival of the ship in the Pacific Islands or the horse on the Great Plains. It did not just make travel easier, it made travel possible in ways that had never been possible before. Now imagine yourself standing in that transformed landscape in the early centuries of the first millennium. The Sahara is fully a desert now, vast and hostile, a barrier between the Mediterranean world of North Africa and the forests and savannas of West Africa. But it is a barrier that can be crossed if you have camels, if you have knowledge, if you have something worth carrying across all that emptiness. And there were things worth carrying, two things especially, two commodities that would drive the creation of trade routes across the desert and shape the rise and fall of empires. One was gold, the other was salt. To understand why salt mattered, why it could be worth its weight in gold, why people would risk their lives to transport it across hundreds of miles of waterless desert, you have to understand salt itself, not as we know it today, abundant and cheap, but as it was experienced in the ancient world. Salt is a simple compound, sodium chloride, common in the earth and in the sea, but its properties are anything but simple. Salt is essential to human life. Your body needs it to regulate fluids, to transmit nerve impulses, to contract muscles. Without salt, you would die, and the dying would not be peaceful. You would experience cramps, weakness, confusion, eventually cardiac arrest. Your body knows this, which is why salt tastes good, why you crave it, why every human culture has sought it out and treasured it. But salt does more than sustain life. It preserves life, or at least the memory of life, the substance of life after death. This was its great value in the world before refrigeration, before canning, before any of the technologies we take for granted. Salt draws moisture out of food through the process of osmosis. Bacteria and fungi need moisture to grow, to multiply, to cause the rot and decay that makes food inedible. By removing that moisture, salt prevents spoilage. A piece of meat treated with salt can last for months, even years, remaining edible when fresh meat would have putrefied within days. Fish can be salted and dried and transported across continents. Vegetables can be preserved in brine. Salt made it possible to store food against times of scarcity, to survive winters, to provision armies and ships and caravans. In the ancient world, salt was produced in several ways, each leaving its mark on the landscape and the economy. In coastal regions, seawater was channeled into shallow ponds where the sun would evaporate the water, leaving behind crystals of salt that could be harvested and sold. This was how much of the Mediterranean world got its salt, from the salt pans of Spain and Italy, of Greece and North Africa. But there was another source of salt, stranger and more dramatic, found in certain places where ancient seas had dried up millions of years ago, leaving behind vast deposits of rock salt buried beneath the earth. In a few places, these deposits reached the surface, creating salt mountains, salt flats, entire landscapes made of the substance that everywhere else had to be extracted from the sea. And in the heart of the Sahara, there were such places, and they would become the sources of a trade that connected two worlds. The most important of these salt sources, the one that would dominate the trans-Saharan trade for centuries, was a place called Tagaza. The name itself seems to carry the harshness of its environment, a word that sits heavy on the tongue. Tagaza was located in the deep Sahara, in what is now northern Mali, though borders and nations are recent concepts in a landscape that has always defied such human conventions. It was not an oasis in any conventional sense. There was water, yes, brackish and barely drinkable, drawn from wells that had to be dug deep into the sand, but there was almost nothing else. No trees, no vegetation beyond a few struggling thorns, no shade, no relief. The temperature in summer could reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun. The wind blew constantly, carrying stinging sand that worked its way into everything, into clothing and food and eyes and lungs. And yet, people lived there, worked there, died there, because beneath the sand and the suffering lay wealth beyond measure. The salt deposits at Tagaza were enormous, thick beds of pure white and pale grey rock salt that could be quarried like stone. The work was brutal and unceasing. Imagine yourself there, in the settlement that grew up around the mines, and try to grasp the strangeness of the place. The houses are built of salt blocks, cut from the same deposits that were being mined. The walls are salt, the floors are salt, the very material of shelter is the material of commerce. When it rains, which is rare, the buildings partially dissolve, and after the rain has passed, the salt residue must be scraped away and the walls rebuilt. Everything tastes of salt, smells of salt, is coated in a fine white dust that never quite washes away. The miners themselves were often enslaved people, captured in wars or raids to the south, or people so desperately poor that they had no other choice but to come to this place of exile and labor. They worked in teams, using simple tools, iron chisels and wooden mallets, to split the salt beds into manageable blocks. The blocks were enormous, some weighing as much as 200 pounds, rectangular slabs cut to a standard size so they could be loaded onto camels. The work required strength and skill, the ability to read the grain of the salt, to find the natural fracture lines where a few well-placed blows would split a massive section into transportable pieces. It was dangerous work. The salt beds sometimes collapsed, burying workers beneath tons of crystalline rock. It was exhausting work, performed under the relentless sun, the glare off the white salt so bright it could damage unprotected eyes. The miners lived in conditions that can only be described as desperate. They slept in the salt block buildings, ate food that was always salted, always preserved, brought in by the same caravans that would carry away the fruits of their labor. They drank the brackish water that tasted of minerals and desert. Many did not survive long, succumbing to heat exhaustion, to disease, to accidents in the mines. But the work continued because the demand for salt was insatiable and because the profits were enormous. The blocks cut from Tagaza would travel south, carried by camel caravan across hundreds of miles of empty desert, to be sold in the markets of West Africa, where salt was scarce and desperately needed, where a block of salt could purchase luxuries, could feed a family for months, could be broken into smaller pieces, and used as currency itself. Standing there in Tagaza, surrounded by the white landscape of salt and sand, you would be standing at one end of a network of trade that stretched across the Sahara and beyond, connecting the Mediterranean world with the interior of Africa, moving goods and ideas and people in patterns that had been established over centuries and would continue for centuries more. But to understand how that network functioned, how it was possible at all, we must follow the salt as it leaves the mines, loaded onto the backs of camels, and begins its long journey south. The preparation of a caravan was an undertaking of enormous complexity and care, for the margin between success and catastrophe in the desert was perilously thin. The caravan leaders, often Berber or Arab traders who had spent their lives mastering the routes, would arrive in Tagaza with strings of camels, sometimes hundreds of animals, sometimes more than 1,000 for the largest expeditions. These were not the single-humped dromedaries alone, but also baggage camels, breeding females, young animals being trained to the work. Each animal had to be inspected, its feet checked for injuries, its body examined for the subtle signs of illness that could turn fatal in the harsh conditions ahead. A lame camel was worse than useless. It was a liability that could slow the entire caravan and put everyone at risk. The salt blocks were loaded with practiced efficiency, 2 blocks per camel, balanced carefully on either side of a wooden frame that sat across the animal's back. The blocks were wrapped in woven mats made from palm fiber to protect them from chipping and to make them easier to handle. Rope made from twisted camel hair secured the load, tightened with knots that would hold even when the camel lurched to its feet or laid down to rest. A well-loaded camel could carry 400 pounds of salt in addition to its own provisions, and it could maintain a walking pace of about 3 miles per hour, hour after hour, day after day, with a patience that seems almost supernatural. But the camels did not carry only salt. They also carried the supplies necessary for the journey itself. Water was the most critical concern, and it was carried in goatskin bags that had been tanned and treated to prevent leakage. Even so, water was heavy and space was limited, so the amount carried was calculated with grim precision based on the known distances between wells. Food for the travelers consisted largely of dried dates, which provided concentrated energy and could survive the heat, along with millet flour that could be mixed with water to make a simple porridge. There was dried meat, heavily salted of course, and sometimes honey, which never spoils and provides quick sustenance. The wealthier traders might carry tea, which had become popular in the region, and sugar, which was itself a valuable trade good. The timing of departure was crucial, dictated by the seasons and the brutal arithmetic of survival. Most caravans left Tagaza in the cooler months, between October and March, when daytime temperatures were merely uncomfortable rather than lethal, and when the chances of encountering sandstorms were reduced. The journey to the markets of the south, to cities like Timbuktu or Gao, would take anywhere from 3 weeks to 2 months, depending on the route, the size of the caravan, and the inevitable delays caused by weather, by animals that fell sick or died, by the need to wait at certain wells for access to water. Now imagine yourself as part of that caravan as it finally departs Tagaza, leaving behind the salt mountains and the grim settlement. The first hours are almost a relief, a sense of purpose and movement after the stagnant suffering of the mines. The camels fall into line, each following the one before it, guided by lead ropes held by the camel drivers who walk alongside. The drivers are experienced men, often Tuareg, the people of the desert who know its moods and its dangers better than anyone. They wear the traditional tagul must, the cloth that wraps around the head and face leaving only the eyes visible, dyed deep indigo blue, the color so saturated that it stains the skin beneath, earning the Tuareg the nickname Blue People of the Desert. The rhythm of travel quickly establishes itself. The caravan moves in the early morning, beginning before dawn when the air is coolest and the stars are still bright overhead. These stars are not merely beautiful, they are essential, for navigation in the featureless desert depends on celestial observation. The experienced guides know the positions of certain stars, know how they move across the sky through the seasons, and use them to maintain direction, even when there are no landmarks visible, when the sand has covered any trace of previous passages. As the sun rises, the temperature rises with it, and by midday the heat becomes oppressive. The caravan halts, the camels are made to kneel, and everyone seeks what shade they can find, often simply huddling behind the camels themselves, using their bodies as windbreaks. The silence of these midday halts is profound, broken only by the occasional grumble of a camel, the whisper of wind across sand, the quiet murmur of prayers as the Muslim travelers perform their devotions. Water is distributed sparingly, each person receiving a measured amount from the communal supply. You learn quickly to sip rather than gulp, to let the water sit in your mouth before swallowing, to make each drop count. The experienced travelers cover themselves completely despite the heat, understanding that exposed skin loses moisture through perspiration far more rapidly than covered skin, that the sun's radiation is an enemy to be blocked rather than embraced. As the afternoon wanes and the sun begins its descent, the caravan prepares to move again. This evening period of travel is often the longest, continuing until well after dark, for the temperature drops and both animals and humans can move more comfortably. The stars emerge one by one, then all at once it seems, the Milky Way spreading across the sky like a river of light. The desert night is cold, sometimes shockingly so, the same sand that baked your feet during the day now drawing heat from your body. The caravan finally halts for the night at a spot chosen by the guides, perhaps a slight depression that offers shelter from the wind, perhaps a place where previous caravans have stopped, marked by the scattered droppings of earlier camels and the ash of old fires. The evening routine unfolds with practiced efficiency. The camels are unloaded and hobbled, their front legs tied together to prevent them from wandering off in search of the sparse vegetation that sometimes appears. Fires are lit using dried camel dung as fuel, for there is no wood in this landscape. The flames are small and precious, used to heat water for tea and to prepare the evening meal. The traders gather in groups around the fires, sharing food and stories, conducting business, discussing the route ahead. There is laughter here, camaraderie born of shared hardship, the human ability to find connection even in extremity. The Tuareg guides might play music, a simple drum or a stringed instrument called an imzad, the melodies haunting and strange to foreign ears, perfectly suited to the vast loneliness of the desert. You lie down to sleep, wrapped in whatever blankets or robes you possess, lying on the sand with perhaps a saddle or a pack for a pillow. The sky above is overwhelming in its clarity, the stars so numerous and bright they seem close enough to touch. You can see satellites of Jupiter with the naked eye if you know where to look, can trace the ecliptic where the planets wander, can find the Southern Cross hanging low on the southern horizon. And if you are very lucky, very quiet in your mind, you might feel something of what the ancient travelers felt, a sense of being suspended between earth and sky, of being a small and temporary thing in a landscape that has existed for millions of years and will exist for millions more. But the beauty of the desert is inseparable from its danger, and not every night passes peacefully. Sandstorms can arise with terrifying speed, announced first by a change in the quality of the light, a yellowish tinge to the air, then by a distant roaring sound like an approaching locomotive. When a sandstorm strikes, there is nothing to do but take shelter as best you can. The camels seem to sense the storms before humans do. They become restless, and the experienced guides will make them sit and will position them so their backs are to the wind. The travelers huddle behind the camels, wrapping their faces completely, trying to breathe through the cloth that filters the air. The sand is everywhere. In your eyes despite being closed, in your mouth despite being covered, in your ears and your clothes and the folds of your skin. The storm may last hours or days, and when it finally passes, the landscape has changed. Dunes that were here are now there. Hollows have filled. The caravan's path has been erased as if it never existed. There are other dangers too, less dramatic but equally deadly. Wells can be found dry, their water exhausted by previous caravans or by the slow contraction of the aquifers beneath the sand. Disease can spread through the caravan, dysentery or fever claiming lives far from any hope of treatment. Raiders sometimes attack, bandits or rival groups seeking to steal the valuable cargo of salt, though the caravans often travel in groups large enough to discourage such attacks. Animals die, collapsing from exhaustion or dehydration or simple bad luck, and when they die their cargo must be redistributed among the remaining camels, slowing the caravan further and increasing the strain on the survivors. And yet, despite all these hazards, the caravans kept moving, year after year, century after century, because at the end of the journey was wealth. The routes across the Sahara were not random wanderings but carefully established paths connecting specific points, passing through known wells and oases, where water could be replenished and where rest was possible. These routes were knowledge, passed down from guide to guide, from generation to generation, knowledge as valuable as any commodity the caravans carried. A guide who knew where to find water in a dry year, who could read the signs of weather, who could navigate by stars and wind and the subtle variations in the texture of the sand. Such a guide was worth his weight in the salt he led across the desert. The wells themselves were places of profound importance, for they were the anchors of life in a lifeless land. Some were natural springs, places where underground water reached the surface through fractures in the rock. Others were dug wells, excavated to tremendous depths by communities or by successive caravans over decades or centuries. The digging a communal project that benefited all who passed. Around the major wells, small settlements grew up, permanent communities that existed to serve the caravans, providing not just water but also food fodder for the animals and sometimes guides for the next leg of the journey. These well settlements were multicultural places, inhabited by people of different ethnicities and languages brought together by the shared enterprise of desert trade. The most important waypoints, though, were the oases, those miraculous places where water was abundant enough to support not just a few palm trees but entire groves, where gardens could be planted and harvested, where life could flourish in the midst of desolation. The great oases like Taudeni, Arawan, Tindouf, and Sijil Massa were vital links in the trans-Saharan network, and some grew into substantial towns with permanent populations numbering in the thousands. These were places where caravans from different directions would converge, where goods would be exchanged and redistributed, where traders from the north carrying Mediterranean goods would meet traders from the south carrying West African products, where information flowed as freely as water. Imagine arriving at an oasis after weeks in the desert, the moment when the first palm trees appear on the horizon, dark green against the pale sky, a sight so beautiful it brings tears to the eyes of hardened travelers. The approach to the oasis follows established paths marked by the bones of animals that did not survive the journey, grim milestones that serve as warnings and guides. As you draw closer, you can hear the sound of water, actual flowing water, a sound so rare and precious in the desert that it seems like music. The air changes, becomes more humid, carries scents of vegetation and earth, and the complex organic smell of human habitation. The oases were organized around their water sources, usually a spring or a series of wells, and the architecture was designed to maximize shade and minimize water loss. Buildings were constructed of mud brick made from the local soil, thick walls that insulated against the heat, small windows to reduce the entry of hot air, flat roofs where people could sleep on hot nights. The streets were narrow, often covered with palm frond awnings that created tunnels of shade. The central area of any oasis was the marketplace, where trade was conducted with a formality and ceremony that reflected its importance. In these markets, the salt that had been carried across the desert would finally meet its buyers. The salt blocks would be unloaded from the camels and arranged in stacks, and merchants would come to inspect them, checking the color and purity, looking for cracks or contamination. The negotiation of prices was a complex process governed by tradition and by the current balance of supply and demand. In years when many caravans had made the journey successfully, the price of salt would be lower. In years when sandstorms or raiders had taken their toll, when fewer caravans arrived, the price would rise accordingly. But even at its lowest, salt from the Sahara commanded remarkable prices in the markets of West Africa, for it was still cheaper and more convenient than the alternative, which was evaporating seawater on the distant coast and transporting it inland. And what did the salt purchase? What goods moved north across the desert to balance the flow of white gold moving south? The answer, more than anything else, was gold. West Africa was rich in gold, unimaginably rich by the standards of the medieval world. The gold came from deposits in the savanna and forest regions to the south of the Sahel, from places like Bambouk and Bure, regions whose exact locations were closely guarded secrets. The gold was not mined in the modern sense, but rather panned from rivers or extracted from shallow surface deposits, and it accumulated in the treasuries of the great West African empires that we must now explore. The first of these empires, and the one that established the pattern for those that followed, was Ghana, though the name is misleading because this ancient empire had no connection to the modern nation of Ghana other than sharing a name. The Ghana Empire arose sometime around the 4th or 5th century in the region between the Senegal and Niger rivers, in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali. Its origins are obscure, lost in the period before written records, but by the time Arabic writers began describing it in the 8th and 9th centuries, Ghana was already a powerful and sophisticated state. The empire's wealth was built on its position, controlling the trade routes between the salt-producing regions of the Sahara and the gold-producing regions to the south. The king of Ghana, called the Ghana, which meant warrior king, imposed taxes on all goods passing through his territory. The system was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its effectiveness. Every donkey or camel load of salt entering the kingdom paid a tax. Every load of salt leaving the kingdom paid another tax. The same for gold, for copper, for all the commodities that moved along the trade routes. These taxes generated enormous revenue, and the revenue allowed the king to maintain a large army, to build monumental architecture, and to support a court of legendary splendor. The capital of Ghana was a city called Kumbi Sele, and the descriptions of it that survive in Arabic sources paint a picture of a place that rivaled anything in the Mediterranean world. The city was actually two cities. A royal quarter where the king and his court resided, built of stone and surrounded by defensive walls, and a merchant quarter where foreign traders, mostly Muslim Berbers and Arabs, lived and conducted their business. The royal quarter contained a palace complex with many buildings, a great audience hall where the king held court, and a sacred grove where the traditional religious practices of the empire were maintained. The king himself, when he appeared in public, was adorned with gold, wearing gold bracelets and necklaces, surrounded by officials carrying gold-mounted swords and shields decorated with gold. But the Ghana Empire was not merely a depot for trade. It was a sophisticated state with systems of administration, law, and military organization. The king maintained order through a network of subordinate chiefs who governed various regions, collecting taxes and providing soldiers for the royal army. The army itself was formidable, numbering in the tens of thousands according to some accounts, equipped with iron weapons and organized into units that could respond quickly to threats on the empire's borders. The empire's power allowed it to maintain the stability necessary for trade to flourish, and the trade in turn provided the wealth that sustained the empire's power. The religion of Ghana was mixed. The king and most of the native population practiced traditional African religions, but the Muslim merchants who lived in the merchant quarter built mosques and practiced Islam openly. This religious tolerance was pragmatic. The king understood that the Muslim traders were essential to his economy, and he protected them and allowed them to live according to their own customs. Over time, Islam began to spread among the native population as well, a process that would accelerate in the centuries to come, but in the Ghana period, the conversion was gradual and incomplete. The Ghana Empire lasted for centuries, reaching its peak in the 10th and 11th centuries, but by the 13th century it had fragmented, weakened by internal conflicts and by pressure from new powers arising around it. One of these new powers would eclipse Ghana entirely, creating an empire even larger and more spectacular, an empire whose name would become synonymous with wealth itself. This was Mali. The Mali Empire arose from the ruins of Ghana in the 13th century, founded by a warrior king named Sundiata Keita, whose story blends history and legend into an epic narrative still told by griots, the oral historians of West Africa. Sundiata was said to have been crippled as a child, unable to walk, mocked by his peers, but he overcame his disability through force of will and grew into a powerful warrior. He united various Mandinka clans and defeated the sorcerer king Sumaro Kante at the Battle of Karina in 1235, a victory that established Mali as the dominant power in the region. But it was Sundiata's descendants, particularly Mansa Musa, who would make Mali famous throughout the medieval world. Mansa Musa reigned from 1312 to 1337, and his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 became one of the most famous journeys in history. The pilgrimage, the Hajj, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, an obligation for all Muslims who are able to undertake it. But Mansa Musa's Hajj was no simple journey. It was a statement of power and wealth on a scale that had never been seen before and has rarely been matched since. The caravan that left Mali in 1324 was enormous, numbering according to various sources anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 people. There were soldiers to provide protection, officials to manage the logistics, servants to attend to the needs of the king and his court, and enslaved people carrying supplies and gold. The gold, there was so much gold. Mansa Musa brought with him dozens of camels, each carrying hundreds of pounds of gold dust and nuggets, a display of wealth so ostentatious it seems almost fictional. But the accounts are multiple and consistent, written by Arab historians who witnessed the caravan's passage, or who spoke with those who did. The journey took the caravan north across the Sahara, following the established trade routes, passing through the same oases and wells that the salt caravans used, but moving in the opposite direction. They crossed into Egypt and made their way to Cairo, the great city that was then the cultural and intellectual center of the Islamic world. Mansa Musa's arrival in Cairo caused a sensation. He distributed gold with a generosity that seemed limitless, giving gifts to officials, to scholars, to random people he encountered in the streets. He funded the construction and repair of mosques. He purchased vast quantities of goods, paying prices that left merchants astonished and delighted. The economic impact was extraordinary and immediate. Mansa Musa gave away so much gold that he flooded the Cairo market, and the price of gold, which had been stable for years, suddenly plummeted. Gold lost perhaps 20% of its value in Cairo and did not recover for more than a decade. This was an economic disruption on a massive scale, the medieval equivalent of a financial crisis, caused not by scarcity but by abundance. On his return journey, Mansa Musa actually had to borrow money, having exhausted his supplies in his generosity, a remarkable reversal that only added to the legend. The pilgrimage made Mansa Musa and his empire famous throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Cartographers began to include Mali on their maps, often depicting Mansa Musa seated on a throne, holding a gold nugget, an image that came to symbolize Africa's wealth. The stories of his generosity and the incredible riches of his kingdom spread through Europe, contributing to the European fascination with African gold that would eventually drive the age of exploration. But Mansa Musa was not merely a spendthrift. He used Mali's wealth to develop his kingdom in profound ways. He brought back with him architects and scholars from the Islamic world. He commissioned the construction of mosques and palaces, including the famous De Guinguet Mosque in Timbuktu, which still stands today. He established centers of Islamic learning, attracting scholars from across the Muslim world to teach and study in his cities. Under his patronage, Timbuktu evolved from a seasonal trading camp into one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world, home to thousands of students and scholars studying theology, law, astronomy, mathematics, and literature. The libraries of Timbuktu became legendary, housing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, texts copied and illuminated by local scribes, treatises on every subject imaginable. These manuscripts survived the centuries, hidden by families who treasured them, passed down through generations, and in recent years they have been catalogued and studied, revealing the extraordinary intellectual life of medieval West Africa. The manuscripts prove beyond doubt that this was not a backward region, but a sophisticated civilization engaged with the broader Islamic world and making its own contributions to human knowledge. The Mali Empire reached its greatest extent under Mansa Musa and his successors, controlling territory from the Atlantic coast in the west to the bend of the Niger River in the east, from the Sahara in the north to the forest regions in the south. Its power was based on the same foundation as Ghana's had been: control of the trade routes and taxation of the goods that moved along them, particularly salt and gold. But Mali was larger than Ghana had been, more centralized, more effective at projecting power across vast distances. Yet even Mali eventually declined, weakened by succession disputes, by the difficulty of governing such a large and diverse territory, and by the rise of a new power in the east. This new power was the Songhai Empire, centered on the city of Gao on the Niger River, and it would become the largest of all the West African empires, reaching its peak in the 15th and 16th centuries under rulers like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad. The Songhai Empire continued the pattern established by its predecessors, controlling trade, accumulating wealth, supporting Islamic learning. But it also innovated, creating a more efficient administrative system, a more professional army, a more systematic approach to governance. The greatest city of the Songhai period was Timbuktu, which became truly cosmopolitan, a place where scholars from Morocco and Egypt taught alongside local intellectuals, where traders from across the Sahara converged to buy and sell goods from 3 continents. The Sankor Mosque in Timbuktu became one of the great universities of the Islamic world, with perhaps 25,000 students at its peak, studying in informal schools attached to the mosque. The city's wealth was such that its buildings were constructed of stone and mud brick rather than the less permanent materials used elsewhere, and gold was reportedly so common that it was used decoratively in everyday objects. But to truly understand how these empires functioned, how they generated and distributed their wealth, we need to look more closely at the mechanics of trade, at the actual exchange of salt for gold and the systems that governed those exchanges. The trade was not simply barter, not a crude swap of one commodity for another, but a sophisticated commercial operation involving credit, contracts, standardized weights and measures, and legal frameworks that protected both buyers and sellers. In some regions, particularly on the periphery of the empires where state control was weaker and where traders from different cultures met with mutual suspicion, a practice called silent trade developed. The Arab historian al-Masudi described this practice in the 10th century, and similar accounts appear in other sources. The traders bringing salt would arrive at an agreed-upon location, usually marked by a large rock or tree or other landmark. They would unload their salt, arranging it in piles, and then withdraw to a distance where they could not be seen. The local gold producers would then approach, examine the salt, and place gold dust beside each pile, according to what they judged the salt was worth. Then they too would withdraw. The salt traders would return and examine the gold. If they were satisfied with the amount, they would take the gold and leave. If not, they would withdraw again, and the gold traders would return and add more gold or remove some, negotiating through this silent back and forth until both parties were satisfied. The system worked because both sides wanted to maintain the trade relationship. Both understood that cheating would end the profitable exchanges. It was trust built through repeated interaction, through the recognition of mutual benefit. A remarkable example of how commerce can create cooperation even across cultural and linguistic barriers. But in the major trading centers, in the markets of Timbuktu and Gao and Dao and Dan, the trade was more direct and more formalized. These were cities under strong governmental control, where law was enforced and where cheating was punished. The introduction of Islam had brought with it Islamic commercial law, which provided detailed rules for contracts, for the resolution of disputes, for the proper conduct of business. Merchants could make agreements that would be enforced by Islamic judges, could extend credit knowing that debts would be collected, could operate with a level of trust and security that made large-scale trade possible. The gold itself came in various forms. Some was dust, tiny particles panned from rivers or extracted from crushed ore, stored in small leather pouches or quills. Some was in nuggets, larger pieces that could be weighed and tested for purity. The wealthiest kingdoms also minted gold coins, though most of the gold traded across the Sahara was unminted, valued by weight rather than as currency. The standard unit of weight was the mithkol, roughly equivalent to 4.5 grams, and prices would be quoted in mithkols of gold. A block of salt might be worth 10 or 15 or 20 mithkols depending on its size and quality and the current market conditions. The traders who conducted this business were professionals, often members of trading families who had been in the business for generations. They had agents in multiple cities, family members or trusted associates who could handle transactions in distant locations. They used sophisticated accounting methods, keeping ledgers that tracked debts and credits, using written contracts to formalize agreements. Many of these traders were Wangara or Dioula, ethnic groups that specialized in long-distance trade, but there were also Berber and Arab traders from the north, Hausa merchants from the east, a cosmopolitan merchant class that transcended ethnic boundaries. The profits from the trade could be enormous, but so could the risks. A merchant who invested his capital in salt, transported it across the desert, and sold it in the south might double or triple his investment, but he might also lose everything if the caravan was attacked, if the animals died, if he arrived to find the market glutted with salt from other caravans. The trade was a gamble, albeit one where skill and knowledge could improve the odds, and those who succeeded became wealthy enough to rival kings. Between the great trading centers and the salt sources, strung out across the desert like beads on a thread, were the smaller settlements, the oases and caravanserais that made the trade possible. These places existed in a state of dependence on the caravans, prospering when trade was good, suffering when it slowed. The populations were mixed, including people who had chosen to settle in these harsh locations because of the economic opportunities they provided, and people who had been exiled or who had fled from conflicts elsewhere. Life in an oasis town had a rhythm dictated by the arrival and departure of caravans. When a large caravan approached, word would spread through the settlement, and everyone would prepare. The well would be cleared and its water level checked. Food would be prepared for sale, dates and millet and whatever vegetables could be grown in the small irrigated gardens. Fodder would be gathered for the camels, the dried grasses and thorny plants that the animals would eat. The caravanserai, the guest house for travelers, would be swept and prepared. The caravanserai was typically a large rectangular building surrounding a central courtyard. The ground floor was open space where the camels could be kept, protected from theft and from wandering off. The upper floor, reached by an external staircase, contained rooms where the travelers could sleep, simple spaces with mats on the floor and perhaps a few cushions, but offering shelter and relative security. There was usually a communal kitchen where food could be prepared and a washing area where travelers could clean themselves, a luxury after weeks in the desert. The arrival of a caravan transformed the quiet settlement into a bustling temporary town. The market would fill with traders buying and selling, exchanging information about conditions on the routes ahead, about prices in the distant markets, about political changes that might affect the trade. There would be entertainment, storytellers and musicians providing diversion for travelers who had been starved for such things in the desert. There would be news, letters from home for some, messages about family or business carried by other travelers and now finally delivered. The caravanserais were also places where caravans might split or combine, where traders heading to different destinations would part ways, where smaller groups might join together for safety on dangerous stretches of the route. They were places where repairs could be made, where sick animals could be left behind to recover or be replaced, where supplies could be replenished. They were, in short, essential infrastructure for the trans-Saharan trade, and their existence made the difference between a trade route and an impossible journey. Among all the peoples who inhabited and traversed the Sahara, none were more perfectly adapted to its demands than the Tuareg. They called themselves the Kel Tamashek, the speakers of Tamashek, but the name Tuareg, probably derived from an Arabic word meaning abandoned by God, became the term by which they were known to outsiders. This was both unfair and oddly appropriate, for the Tuareg lived in a landscape that did seem abandoned by all divine providence, yet they not only survived there but flourished. The Tuareg were not a single unified people, but rather a confederation of tribes and clans spread across the central and western Sahara, from southern Algeria and Libya, down through Niger and Mali. They were Berber in language and culture, descended from the ancient inhabitants of North Africa, who had retreated into the desert as successive invasions of Arabs and others had claimed the more hospitable regions. In the desert, they developed a way of life uniquely suited to the environment, becoming pastoralists who herded camels, goats, and sheep, moving with the seasons to find pasture and water, and becoming the masters of the caravan trade. The most distinctive feature of Tuareg culture, the thing that struck every outside observer, was the tagelmust, the veil worn by men. Unlike in many Muslim cultures, where women veiled and men did not, among the Tuareg it was the men who covered their faces while women went unveiled. The tagelmust was made from long strips of cotton cloth, often dyed with indigo, wrapped around the head and face, leaving only the eyes exposed. The indigo dye would leach out of the cloth, staining the skin beneath a deep blue, and this gave rise to the romantic name by which Europeans came to know the Tuareg, the blue men of the desert. The veil served multiple practical purposes. It protected the face from sun and wind and blowing sand. It could be dampened and placed over the nose and mouth as a filter during sandstorms, but it also had profound cultural significance. A man would begin wearing the tagelmust at the onset of adulthood, and removing it in the presence of others, particularly women or elders, was considered shameful. The veil created a kind of privacy even in public, a boundary between the self and the world that was respected in Tuareg society. Tuareg society was organized along tribal lines, with each tribe controlling certain territories and certain routes. The society was notable for being matrilineal, with descent and inheritance passing through the mother's line rather than the father's. Women in Tuareg culture had remarkably high status compared to many other societies of the time. They could own property, divorce their husbands, and participate in public discussions. They were often literate, educated in the Taifanar script, an ancient alphabet used to write the Tamashek language. Love poetry was a highly developed art form, and much of it was composed and performed by women. The Tuareg were essential to the trans-Saharan trade, because they knew the desert in ways that no outsider ever could. They knew where to find water during the dry season, which wells were reliable and which might be dry, which routes were passable after the rains and which would be flooded. They could read the landscape, recognizing features invisible to untrained eyes that indicated the presence of a buried well or a passage through a difficult region. They could navigate by the stars, by the wind, by the flight of birds, by subtle variations in the color and texture of the sand. Many caravans hired Tuareg guides, paying them handsomely for their knowledge and their protection. For the Tuareg also controlled access to certain routes, and a caravan that did not pay for safe passage might find itself harassed or attacked. This was not simple banditry, though raiding was also part of Tuareg culture, but rather a system of taxation not unlike what the empires to the south imposed. The Tuareg saw themselves as the rightful masters of the desert, and they demanded compensation from those who crossed their territory. The relationship between the Tuareg and the settled empires to the south was complex and sometimes antagonistic. The empires wanted to control the trade, to tax it and regulate it, but they could not project power effectively into the deep desert where the Tuareg held sway. There were periods of cooperation, when Tuareg clans would ally with one empire or another, providing military service as cavalry in exchange for payment or trading privileges. There were also periods of conflict, when Tuareg raids would threaten the trade routes or when empires would launch punitive expeditions into the desert, though these expeditions rarely achieved lasting results. The Tuareg themselves engaged in trade, not just as guides and protectors but as merchants in their own right. They bred and sold camels, which were always in high demand. They produced salt in some regions, extracting it from salt flats and selling it to passing caravans. They worked as artisans, particularly in leather and metalwork, producing saddles and bags and weapons that were prized for their quality. And they participated in the slave trade, raiding agricultural communities for captives who would be sold in the markets of the north and south. But perhaps the most important role the Tuareg played in the trans-Saharan trade was as the living memory of the routes, the keepers of knowledge about the desert that allowed the trade to continue across generations. When old trade routes were abandoned and new ones established, it was often Tuareg guides who pioneered the new paths, who found the wells and the passages that made travel possible. When political upheavals disrupted the trade, it was the Tuareg who maintained contact between north and south, who ensured that the flow of goods and information never completely ceased. To travel with a Tuareg guide in the medieval period was to place your life in the hands of someone who understood the desert as intimately as a sailor understands the sea, who could read its moods and anticipate its dangers, who knew where safety lay and how to reach it. It was also to enter into a relationship of mutual dependence, for the guide's reputation and future business depended on bringing his charges safely to their destination, just as the trader's success depended on the guide's skill and honesty. As the centuries passed, the great trans-Saharan trade routes that had enriched the empires of West Africa and connected them to the Mediterranean world began to face challenges that would ultimately reduce their importance. These challenges came from multiple directions, from changes in technology and geography, from political upheavals, and from the arrival of European powers on the coast of West Africa, offering alternative routes for trade. The first major disruption came in the late 16th century, with the Moroccan invasion of the Songhai Empire. Morocco, which controlled the northern terminus of the trans-Saharan routes, had long envied the wealth of the Sudanic kingdoms to the south. In 1591, the Moroccan Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur sent an army across the Sahara to conquer Songhai. The army was relatively small, perhaps 4,000 men, but it was equipped with firearms which the Songhai forces lacked. At the Battle of Tondibi, the Moroccan musketeers defeated a much larger Songhai army that relied on traditional weapons and cavalry. The Moroccan victory shattered Songhai's political unity, but it did not bring Morocco the wealth it had hoped for. The gold mines were located far to the south of the conquered territories, in regions that the Moroccans could not effectively control. The trade itself became more fragmented and dangerous as political authority collapsed and various factions competed for power. The Moroccans established a puppet state in Timbuktu, but it was weak and unstable, unable to maintain the security that trade required. At the same time, European powers were developing a maritime route to West Africa that bypassed the Sahara entirely. Portuguese explorers had been probing down the coast of Africa since the 15th century, and by the late 1400s they had established trading posts in what is now Ghana and Nigeria. These coastal posts offered West African kingdoms an alternative outlet for their gold and other goods, one that did not require the dangerous and expensive crossing of the Sahara. European ships could carry larger cargoes than camel caravans and could make the journey more quickly, and in some ways more safely. The shift was gradual rather than sudden, but its effects were profound. The volume of trade crossing the Sahara declined, not disappearing entirely, but reducing to a fraction of what it had been during the height of the Mali and Songhai periods. The great trading cities of the interior, Timbuktu, Gao, Jan, entered a slow decline as commerce shifted to the coast. The caravans still ran, but they were smaller and less frequent. The profits that had sustained empires now flowed through different channels, enriching coastal kingdoms and European merchants rather than the Saharan traders and Sudanic states. European colonization in the 19th century delivered the final blow to the trans-Saharan trade in its traditional form. As France, Britain, and other European powers carved up Africa into colonies, they imposed new borders, new systems of taxation, new regulations that disrupted the old trading patterns. The colonizers built railways and roads that connected the interior to the coast, making the desert routes obsolete. The salt trade in particular collapsed as cheaper salt from European sources flooded the markets. The political entities that had controlled and taxed the trade, the emirates and sultanates and kingdoms, were conquered or reduced to vassals of the colonial powers. By the early 20th century, the great caravans were largely a memory. There were still some traders who made the journey, still camels carrying goods across the desert, but it was a marginal activity, a remnant of a once great system. The caravanserais fell into ruin. The wells were abandoned as people moved to places where water was more reliably available. The trading cities adapted to new realities, finding new economic bases, or slowly emptying as their populations migrated elsewhere. Yet even as the trade declined, its legacy endured in multiple forms. The physical infrastructure it created, the wells and the routes and the cities, remained part of the landscape even when no longer used for their original purpose. The cultural connections it forged, linking North Africa with West Africa, the Mediterranean with the Sahel, persisted in shared religious practices, in linguistic influences, in the movement of ideas and artistic styles. Islam, which had spread along the trade routes carried by Muslim merchants and scholars, became deeply rooted in West Africa and remains the dominant religion in much of the region today. The memory of the trade also lived on in oral traditions, in the stories told by griots and by families who traced their ancestry to the merchant dynasties of the past. In some Tuareg communities, there are still people who can recite the old roots, who remember the names of wells that no longer exist, who keep alive the knowledge even though the practical need for it has passed. This is not nostalgia for a golden age, though elements of that exist, but rather a preservation of identity, a way of maintaining connection to a past that shaped the present. In recent decades, there has been renewed interest in the trans-Saharan trade among historians and archaeologists. Excavations at sites like Kumbi Sale and Sijil Masa have revealed the physical remains of the trading cities, the stone foundations and the pottery shards, and the other artifacts of daily life. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, threatened by conflict and climate, have been catalogued and digitized, revealing the intellectual sophistication of medieval West Africa to a wider audience. Scholars have traced the routes using satellite imagery, identifying the locations of abandoned wells and caravanserais, mapping the old pathways across the desert. And remarkably, the salt trade itself has not entirely disappeared. Small caravans still make the journey from Tawadeni to Timbuktu, following routes that have been used for more than 1,000 years. The trade is no longer economically significant on a large scale, for modern trucks can transport salt more efficiently than camels. But in some remote areas, particularly in northern Mali, the traditional caravans continue because the terrain is too difficult for vehicles, because fuel is expensive and unreliable, because the knowledge and the animals and the will to continue exist. These modern salt caravans are shadows of their historical predecessors, smaller and fewer and economically marginal, but they serve as a living link to the past. The men who lead them, often Tuareg or Berbic Arabs, are continuing a tradition that their ancestors practiced. The camels still carry the same rectangular blocks of salt, cut by hand from the same deposits. The journey is still dangerous, still demanding, still a testament to human endurance and the drive to trade across impossible distances. To witness one of these caravans is to see history moving through the present, to understand in a visceral way that the past is not entirely gone, that it persists in practices and knowledge and in the landscape itself. The Sahara that those travelers cross is the same Sahara crossed by countless generations before them, the same sand and the same stars and the same profound silence. The salt they carry connects them to a trade that built empires, that shaped cultures, that demonstrated the power of human ingenuity to overcome environmental obstacles and create wealth where none seemed possible. The legacy of the trans-Saharan salt trade can be measured in many ways beyond the physical remnants and the continuing small-scale caravans. It can be measured in the cultural and genetic mixing that occurred wherever the trade routes touched, creating populations that blended African and Berber and Arab ancestry. It can be measured in language, in the loan words that traveled with the traders, Arabic words that entered West African languages, and West African words that entered North African dialects. It can be measured in architecture, in the distinctive style of mosques and houses built in the Sahel cities, combining Islamic design principles with local materials and techniques. It can also be measured in economic concepts and practices that the trade helped to spread. The use of standardized weights and measures, essential for trade, became common across the region. Systems of credit and contract law, derived largely from Islamic jurisprudence, provided the legal framework for commercial activity. The concept of the merchant as a professional class, distinct from farmers or herders or artisans, became established in societies that had previously been organized primarily along kinship lines. These may seem like abstract concepts, but they had profound effects on how societies organized themselves and how individuals made their livelihoods. The intellectual legacy is perhaps the most enduring. The scholars who came to Timbuktu and Gawan to study and teach brought with them knowledge from across the Islamic world, and they also learned from local traditions and created new knowledge that they sent back to other centers of learning. The libraries that accumulated in these cities preserved not just religious texts but works on mathematics and astronomy, on medicine and law, on history and literature. When these manuscripts are studied today, they reveal a level of intellectual engagement that challenges simplistic narratives about Africa's past. For too long, the history of Africa was written by outsiders who saw only what they expected to see, who imposed their own categories and prejudices on complex realities. The story of the trans-Saharan trade, when properly understood, contradicts the narrative of African isolation and backwardness. It shows instead a continent connected to the wider world, engaged in sophisticated commercial and intellectual exchange, creating wealth and culture and knowledge on its own terms. The salt roads were not primitive trails but arteries of a global economy, as significant in their time as the Silk Road or the maritime routes of the Indian Ocean. Today, if you travel to the sites of the great trading cities, you will find landscapes that bear the marks of a faded grandeur. Timbuktu still exists, a modest town in northern Mali, its population much reduced from its medieval peak, its economy struggling. But the mosques remain, the Dingreba and the Sankor and the Sidi Yahya, built of mud brick that must be replastered every year to protect against the rains, their wooden beams protruding from the walls in a distinctive style that has become iconic. These buildings are not ancient in the sense of being stone monuments that have stood unchanged for millennia. They are ancient in the sense of being constantly renewed, maintained by each generation, living structures that embody continuity through change. The manuscripts are there too, though they are threatened. During the conflicts that have plagued Mali in recent years, there were fears that the manuscripts would be destroyed by extremists who saw them as un-Islamic or simply as valuable objects to be sold. Librarians and families who owned manuscript collections took extraordinary risks to preserve them, hiding them or smuggling them out of the city to safety. Many manuscripts were saved, but some were lost, burned or stolen or simply abandoned to the elements. The effort to preserve what remains continues, a race against time and decay and human destructiveness. The old city of Kumbi Saleh lies in ruins in Mauritania, its stone buildings collapsed, its streets covered by sand. Archaeologists have excavated parts of the site, revealing the layout of the city, the grand houses, and the mosaic, the evidence of long-distance trade in the form of Mediterranean glass beads and pottery from North Africa. But much remains buried, and the site is remote and difficult to access, visited by few. The city that once rivaled any in the world in wealth and sophistication is now a scatter of ruins in a desert landscape, a monument to impermanence. Tododani, the salt source that fed the trade, still produces salt. The mines are still worked, still using hand tools to extract the blocks, still employing laborers who work in conditions that would be familiar to their medieval predecessors. The settlement is one of the most isolated and inhospitable places on Earth, reachable only by weeks of camel travel or by four-wheel drive vehicles that must navigate trackless sand. Yet people still live there because salt still has value, still needs to be extracted and transported to markets where it can be sold. The routes themselves are mostly invisible now, erased by wind and time, marked only by the knowledge of those who still use them, and by the occasional archaeological site where a well or a caravanserai once stood. But with satellite imagery and GPS, researchers have been able to trace many of the old paths to identify the corridors of movement across the desert. These digital maps are in some ways more detailed than any map that existed in the medieval period, when the routes existed primarily in the memories of guides and in the oral traditions passed from generation to generation. What remains most powerfully is the story itself, the narrative of human achievement and endurance, of the transformation of a barrier into a bridge, of the creation of wealth from the intersection of scarcity and abundance. The trans-Saharan salt trade was not a footnote to history, but a central chapter in the story of medieval Africa and the medieval world. It connected civilizations, transmitted ideas, moved goods and people across vast distances. and in doing so it changed the societies on both ends of the route and everywhere in between. The white gold of the desert, the salt that seemed so humble and so essential, was the catalyst for this transformation. It drove the caravans across the sand and made the journey worthwhile despite the dangers and the hardships. It created demand that pulled gold from the earth and learning from distant cities. It built empires and funded universities and enriched merchants and sustained populations. And it did all this not through any inherent quality beyond its usefulness, but through the human ability to recognize value and to organize collectively to extract and transport and trade that value. As you stand now at the edge of the Sahara in your imagination, as the last light fades from the sky and the stars begin to appear, you can almost see them, those ancient caravans, moving across the dunes in an endless procession. You can almost hear the groaning of the camels, the songs of the drivers, the whispered prayers of travelers hoping for safe passage. You can almost smell the salt and the sand and the sweat, feel the cold wind of the desert night, taste the dust on your lips. These sensations connected you across the centuries to people who lived in a world different from yours in almost every way, but who shared your basic humanity, your need for salt and connection and meaning. The trade shaped the desert and was shaped by it, creating over centuries a system so intricate and so effective that it sustained multiple empires and connected two regions of Africa that might otherwise have remained isolated from each other. When that system finally declined, it left behind traces physical and cultural and intellectual, traces that we are still uncovering and interpreting, still learning from. The desert itself remains indifferent to human ambitions and human suffering, as it was before the first caravans crossed it, and as it will be long after the last one has passed. But for a time, for nearly 1,000 years, the Sahara was not a wasteland, but a workspace, not an obstacle, but an opportunity, not the end of the world, but its vibrant center. The trade that crossed it was one of the great commercial enterprises of the medieval period, comparable in scale and impact to any other, and its story deserves to be known and remembered. It is a story of salt and gold, of camels and cities, of merchants and kings and scholars and guides. It is a story of the ordinary miracle of trade, the way that human beings can create value by moving things from where they are abundant to where they are scarce, and in doing so can build connections that transcend geography and culture. So now, as this journey comes to its end, as you prepare to return from the past to the present, carry with you an image, a camel caravan moving across the dunes at dawn, the white blocks of salt catching the first light, the travelers wrapped against the cold, the desert stretching endlessly in all directions, beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent. This image, this moment, repeated countless times over countless generations, is the heart of the story, the essential truth beneath all the details of empires and economics. People crossed the desert because it was there, and because there was something on the other side worth reaching. They crossed it despite the danger and the difficulty, because they were driven by necessity and by ambition and by the simple human impulse to see what lies beyond the horizon. The salt roads of the ancient Sahara are quiet now, most of them, abandoned to the wind and the forgetting that time brings. But they are not gone, not entirely. They persist in memory and in scholarship, in the rare caravans that still make the journey, in the manuscripts and the ruins and the landscape itself. They persist in the cultural mixing and the intellectual legacy and the economic patterns that they established. They persist because we choose to remember them, to study them, to tell their stories. And in that persistence, in that remembering, the past remains alive, speaking to us across the silence of the centuries. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with me tonight, for crossing the desert in your imagination, for learning the stories of people who lived and worked and died in one of the harshest environments on Earth, but who created something enduring nonetheless. The journey was long, as all desert crossings are, but I hope it was worthwhile, that you have gained some understanding of a world that no longer exists but that shaped the world we inhabit now. As you drift towards sleep, let the images of the desert accompany you, the stars over the dunes, the patient camels, the markets filled with salt and gold, the scholars in their libraries, the guides reading the landscape with eyes that saw what others could not. Let these images be companions to your rest, gentle and distant and real in the way that history is real, present in its absence, alive in its ending.